The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show. I'm Charles Christian, I'm your host, and thank you very much for listening in again. This week we have another interview and we continue our seasonal theme with more Christmas ghost stories and, frankly, just plain weird Yuletide folklore. We also delve into the question of who was Santa Claus? Could he be related to the pagan god Odin? You better watch out, you better not cry, you better not pout, I'm telling you why. Krampus is coming to town. Yes, as promised, it's time for some weird Christmas folklore, which you'll probably enjoy telling your offspring, particularly if you have naughty feral children in the house running around all over the holiday season. We're all familiar with the refrain that Christmas is for children, and that also Santa Claus checks his list to see who has been naughty or nice. However, the modern-day commercialisation of Christmas has sadly buried one of the older Christmastide traditions, and this is also a season when naughty children and adults should be severely punished for any sins they have committed over the previous 12 months. The best known of these traditions involves the Krampus, the half-goat, half-demon companion of St. Nicholas, who visits on Krampus night, which is the eve of the festival of St. Nicholas. That's the December the 6th. Krampus originated in the Alpine regions of Central Europe, although nowadays he, or is it it, has become a European-wide phenomenon, and there's even a growing following in North America. According to folklore, the Krampus will beat naughty children with a whip or birch rod, or, if they've been particularly wicked, he will bundle them into a wicker basket and then carry them off to drown and or eat. Now, even where the Krampus is not part of the traditional folklore of a country, the idea that St. Nicholas is accompanied by a malevolent companion to punish or scare naughty children is well established. These include Knecht Rupert in Germany, Belschnickel, originally in Germany but now also to be found in parts of the United States and Canada, and Zwart Piet, or Black Pete, in the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. Then there is Frau Perchta, the Christmas witch of Austrian-German folklore, who spends the 12 days of Christmas going from house to house, checking if people have been good. If you've been good, she'll leave a silver coin in your shoe. If you've been bad, she will slice your belly open, remove your internal organs and fill the gaping wound with straw and rocks. That'll teach you. Incidentally, there is a theory that the shiny baubles we hang up on Christmas trees are derived from the old glass witch balls which were once hung up in homes to keep witches away. And let's not forget Iceland. That's the country, not the supermarket for people in the UK, which has a whole family of trolls and ogres who will hunt you down and eat naughty children over the period from the 12th of December to the 6th of January. The matriarch of this family is the ugly giantess Grilla, who, appropriately enough, likes to cook children, not quite grill them, but boil them, in a large pot. Like Frau Perchta, Grilla also has a penchant for, and I'm quoting here, carving out the stomachs of children. Grilla has 13 mischievous children known as the Yule lads. They're all giants as well, who take it in turns to harass and annoy people in ways that sometimes, by modern standards, are comical rather than frightening. For example, and I'm apologising here for my appalling pronunciation, Bejunknakrihir, which basically means sausage swiper, hides in the rafters of kitchens so he can steal sausages that have been hung up to smoke. That's cook as opposed to inhale tobacco, I should hasten to add. Children traditionally place shoes on windowsills for the Yule lads. If they had been good, a small gift would be left. If they were disobedient, the Yule lads would leave a potato, which I suppose is better than having your stomach sliced open. Going back to Grilla there, she also has a pet cat known as Jolacturin, the Yule Cat. It is huge, vicious, and prowls the snowy-covered countryside, looking to pounce upon and eat people who have not received new clothes to wear before Christmas. This sort of dates back to the days when everybody wove their own clothes. And so if you didn't have new clothes for Christmas, you're obviously a very lazy person because you hadn't been doing your weaving and your sewing. Anyway, the fear of the Yule Cat has given rise to a tradition in Iceland where everybody goes out and buys and wears a new pair of socks for Christmas Eve. Phew! I'll be glad when the festive season is over. Now for our interview, which is with Martin Wall, the author of the book The Magical History of Britain, which traces the influence of magic and myth from the earliest times to the present day by way of the druids, the Arthurian tales and the Glastonbury legends. And hello, Martin Wall.
Hello, Charles.
Thanks for making the time to speak to me, and we're going to be talking about your book, The Magical History of Britain, which came out earlier this year and is a fascinating story for anybody who's interested in the way myth and magic has permeated the British Isles from the times of the druids through to modern times. And say yours is very interesting because you do take it up to modern times rather than just sort of ending with Matthew Hopkins and Witchfinder General. But for the benefit of people who haven't seen the book, read the book, and we'll give them an opportunity where to find it later, can you just summarise what the basic concept behind the book is?
Well, I guess how I put it is a personal sort of account of the development of magical and mythical ideas through British history, and how that has actually come together to create a kind of national cultural identity, which has sustained itself over, well, maybe 3,000 years, really, and asking the kind of question: is any of this still relevant in a very sort of changed modern environment, or is it kind of just now a sort of side issue? For people who may be aficionados of that kind of subject matter. Yeah, I mean, I originally, my idea was to call it Our Magical History of Britain, but the publishers wanted it to sort of sound more definitive.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously, for each person, all of this history will culminate for them in a different way than it would for another person. And obviously, I didn't want to sort of give the idea that this is definitive. It is a personal account, and people should know that. But nevertheless, I sort of endeavoured to cover as much of the materials as I could to try to support the idea that actually all this stuff actually still is relevant, and especially so in a sort of time of very rapid and far-reaching cultural changes, and illustrating that with many, some famous, some very obscure practitioners of magic, myth, spiritual philosophy throughout the ages, who have contributed in their own way and in their own changing times to the kind of process of our national identity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I say one thing that is interesting is where you bring in the impact of the British Empire, if you like, and the fact we start taking on influences from abroad, from other cultures.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
adding it into it. And indeed, there's an element, I suppose, that it is now probably the loosely called the immigrant population who are the widest practitioners of magic, would you say, at the moment? You know,
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the 21st century, I mean, I don't delve into that perhaps as much as I should have done. Yeah, I mean, for many people who are living in Britain now, you know, their host culture, their original culture, would have been permeated by magical ideas. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to sort of stress that these ideas aren't just kind of crazy and wacky. They really have had a huge impact on the development of British imperialism, as you mentioned, John Dee particularly, who sort of more or less came up with the concept of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And from being kind of, you know, even in those days, quite obscure and secretive ideas, that has actually changed the political paradigm of the whole world since the 16th century. Of course, that's had a massive impact all across the world because of, you know, the sort of cultural legacy of British imperialism and now an American sort of simulacrum.
Yes.
And so, yeah, still very relevant. And I wanted to try to track these ideas back in time to their most primordial origins, which I guess really becomes that's even before the Druids, you know, back to the megalithic monuments and, you know, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and settled communities, you know.
Yes, because, I mean, the point that's often missed is that, you know, in popular fiction, we see the Druids plotting against the Romans at Stonehenge, but in fact Stonehenge was built, a couple of thousand years before the Druids appeared on the scene.
Yeah. Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, there are some people now who contend that some kind of ritual enclosure existed down in Wiltshire, maybe even 10,000 years ago. So, I mean, that's pretty mind-boggling stuff when you think about it.
Well, it is. I mean, given 10,000 years ago, well, we were still connected to the continent by through the North Sea in those days. So yes, that is going a long way back. Yeah. One area you do cover a lot on, and I'm guessing it also follows up from one of your interests, where you talk about one of your earlier books, the Anglo-Saxon Age, is the that period, which tends to be rather glossed over in school histories. You know, it starts at 1066, and everything before that is a bit vague, and it's the Dark Ages and the Vikings, and that's it. But I mean, that was a, 500-year period of our history, and we have so much of our traditions still date back to that, don't they? I mean, the days of the week are named after the Saxon gods.
Yeah. I mean, the Dark Age period to me is very fascinating. I mean, where I got stimulated to write really was it was the discovery of the Staffordshire hoard in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 10 years ago, and that really was a kind of for me, because I live very near there.
Yeah.
it was a real kind of moment of truth, you know. When I first went to see, I used to work at the exhibition there in Birmingham.
Yeah.
And that find was right on the cusp of the transition between paganism and Christianity. I mean, exactly at that point.
Yeah.
That throws up a lot of interesting questions because obviously this area where I live was still pagan until the 670s, really.
Yeah.
When it was conquered by the Northumbrians briefly. And but that doesn't mean to say that it's obscure, and it doesn't need to be mystified, I don't think, quite as much as it is, really, because the history is there, but because it seems somewhat alien to our modern minds, and I think the Norman conquest had a big influence on that, and still does, it tends to be a kind of a marginal interest in education, except in specialist university departments, etc.
Yeah.
But, I mean, for our sort of emotional culture, I think it's still really relevant. I mean, as you say, the language, as you say, the days of the week, many of the place names, and many of the towns that we still inhabit, all were thriving communities way back then, you know.
Yeah, yeah. For people who aren't familiar with it, just tell me a little bit more about the Staffordshire hoard, what it contained.
Well, originally it was discovered by a metal detectorist, Terry Herbert, who had been having a look over that field for some time, and he'd never discovered anything, of any real significance. And then one day in July of 2009, bingo, he finds 4,000 quite small, but very valuable and very beautiful crafted objects, which once they'd been, curated by the museum, comprise really something. I mean, it is literally like finding Tutankhamun's tomb in South Staffordshire, really.
Yeah.
So if people haven't been to see it, I mean, it is a staggering sort of experience to see that. I mean, certainly the most important find since Sutton Hoo in 1939.
Yeah.
But the only Anglo-Saxon hoard that exists. I mean, that we don't have another one. And it seems to me that that these are objects that have been given up as tribute, probably by King Oswy of Northumbria to King Penda of the pagan king of Mercia, really to buy off his invasion,
Yeah.
And it could well be that, this cache of objects could well have been part of his own, kind of personal plunder from that expedition,
Right.
So, I mean, it sort of brings to light something, from the Dark Ages. And of course, the other thing is the extraordinary craftsmanship involved. How it was done just defies belief, really. Without, they've tried to reproduce replicas in the Birmingham Jewellery Quarter, and they've had to resort to this 3D printing technology to do it, because no living person could do that kind of work now.
Yeah, because it's gold, isn't it? A lot of gold there.
There's 11 pounds of gold by weight.
Yeah.
And about 3.5 pounds of silver.
Yeah.
And many thousands of very finely worked garnets. So nearly all of the gold work is inlaid with garnets, which incidentally had a magical significance, because it was thought that there was a magical connection, a sort of sympathetic magical connection between garnets, which are blood red, and the healing of battle wounds. So it's a kind of protective armour, if you like, a sort of spiritual armour.
Right.
So
yeah.
these people weren't just, they weren't like medieval knights in kind of chainmail. They did have armour, and helmets and all those things, but these things were superbly crafted and exquisitely decorated in a way, really, that no other culture has equalled ever since.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. You're saying that the Saxon hordes are rare. Well, that's the only one, so it's unique, isn't it? As opposed to the ones that were left over at the end of the Roman period in this country. Yeah. I
mean, they're mainly numismatic hordes, coins.
Yes.
But this isn't that. This is all decorative military regalia.
Mm-hmm.
They've now reconstructed the helmet, which must, I believe, have belonged to a king.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any other ranking sort of person would have worn such a helmet. And the other major contributor to the horde is hilt guards and pommels. And the decorations for swords, but obviously no sword blades because they would have reused those.
Yeah.
But all the rest of it, anything of value would have been removed.
Yeah.
And taken away for the king.
Yeah. Yeah. When you set about writing the book, did you have a particular vision in mind, or is it one of those things that you were following an idea and then, like Topsy, it just growed and more things came into it and you were discovering things you hadn't previously been aware of?
Well, about 10 years ago or so, I did a kind of dry run of this book, really, which almost got a publisher. The university press, but it didn't quite do it, and in fact, I'm quite glad it didn't, really, because it isn't the book that this is. But I laid it aside and thought, well, that is something like that is what I want to do. I was very influenced in this by one of our local kind of characters from literature. His name was Laomon, and Anglo-Saxon preacher, who lived in what is now Stourport in Worcestershire, who basically, he was the first man to translate the ancient history of Britain into English.
Right.
So before that, really, you needed to be reading the original legends in either a Celtic language like Breton or Welsh, or Latin, or French, Norman French. That meant that, ironically, the Anglo-Saxon population of England were kind of excluded from the entirety of the island's history, and had no real connection with it until that time. But obviously, from that time, particularly the Arthurian legends, were suddenly part of the English imagination as well as the British imagination. And that had massive consequences, because then as English modern English gradually established itself as the national tongue instead of Norman French, then and then went on to become the most widely spoken language in the world. That influence means that King Arthur isn't sort of just ours anymore. He's a sort of hero figure all over the world now.
Was there anything, did you, in the course of researching it, uncover things you hadn't previously been aware of or appreciated?
As I was writing the book, you mean?
Yeah,
during the write-up.
Yeah, did you sort of come up and discover some surprises that you hadn't envisaged, where you follow a line of research and it takes you somewhere that you didn't expect to go, and there's something interesting lurking at the bottom of that rabbit hole?
Well, I mean, I guess there probably are things like that, but because I'd already done, as I say, this other book 10 years ago, I knew, broadly speaking, what the roadmap was for the project. Yeah. And I think what it was I wasn't quite as ambitious back then as I am now, because I didn't want to I didn't think I could take it right up to the present day. Yeah. But gradually, I mean, one surprise, if you want to call it a surprise, was that I started to look for a complete magical system that would have relevance in the modern world, and which still had connections to mystical and magical and mythographical predecessors. Yeah. And where that led me, I think in the end, was the Inklings group in Oxford in the 30s and 40s. And that's where I sort of kind of conclude the book, because I think that, yeah, those people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield and Charles Williams, what they were doing really was stuff that was right on the sort of frontiers of magic, really. Yeah. I mean, Tolkien particularly, but I think it was interesting that they felt, all of them, that in order to restore meaning in our somewhat alienated modern existence, we need to reconnect to the sort of most primordial consciousness that we have of our ancestors, really, and also to the land. So that's another thing that has been very important for me, is to sort of to track this back to the landscape itself and how that has shaped our conception of magical and mythical ideas.
Give us a sort of an example of the landscape. I mean, there's a wonderful picture you've got on the back cover, which I'm guessing is that Glastonbury tour in the background there.
Yeah, that's it.
which is, does sum it up, that sort of Mists of Avalon look about it. Say a little bit more about the landscape side of things.
Yeah, I mean, Glastonbury is an ideal example because, one of the characters in the book is Dion Fortune, a very famous English mystic and magical practitioner, responsible really for the kind of magical defence of Britain during the Second World War, amongst other things. Yeah. But I mean, where she lived, she actually lived in Glastonbury, is buried in Glastonbury, by what I believe were mystical connections. She was led to Glastonbury tour, where she lived. She had a kind of inner vision of that area, of that landscape, which is full of all the legends of King Arthur, Joseph of Arimathea, even of Christ himself, who is alleged to have visited the area. Yes. And founded the abbey personally. Some say the first church above ground in the world. And she identified what she called the Glastonbury zodiac, which she believed could be discerned for people with spiritual insight, actually in the landscape itself. Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting concept. And I've had myself personal experience of very, what I'd call liminal experiences when I've been on top of the tour a few times, and not under the influence of any any other thing. Yes. But no, genuinely, and in company with, on one occasion, with about 200 other people, a real experience, which, you're never going to probably encounter again in your life, So I do think that there are power centres. Our ancestors certainly believe this. Another example, of course, is rivers. Rivers were worshipped as goddesses.
Yes.
There's a fellow around here, an Oxford archaeologist, who believes that Stephen J. Yates, his name is, he wrote a book called The Tribe of Witches, a very interesting book, and quite a scholarly work, certainly not the work of anybody, wacky.
Yeah.
He believes that the local tribe along the Severn Valley, for instance, literally deified the landscape and worshipped a personified form of a goddess, which he's found archaeology for all over Gloucestershire, Worcestershire, and these parts really, and that inculcated me with an idea that hills, rivers, all of these things that have been important to. I mean, when I lived in Ireland briefly, I soon became aware that there is a sort of living tradition of all these things, and the same is true really in very rural parts of Wales and possibly Cornwall as well. I don't know so much about that, but these sort of Celtic countries still have a kind of a real sense of the sacred in the landscape, which I think industrialism has kind of crushed beneath its all of the developments we've had since the Industrial Revolution has kind of sublimated all that in our consciousness. But there are times, I think, for everyone really, where suddenly these forces, these kind of psychic and sacred forces, break through into less sacred reality, and that can be it can be very profoundly spiritually meaningful, in a time when we really need that, I think.
Yeah, you're talking on that. I mean, that was one of the themes in Tolkien, isn't it, at the end of the Lord of the Rings, where, I don't think it's in the movie, was it the scouring of the Shire or something, where it's being polluted, and that was his sort of reaction to the industrialisation around the areas he grew up. Yeah,
well, not so far away from where I am now. He grew up, and of course, these influences were very powerful on him, because where he grew up, like myself, was right on the border. I think borders are very important as well, actually, and go back a very long way often in history. But right on the border between Worcestershire and the city of Birmingham, which then wasn't quite as vast as it is now, and so he could kind of look out into another world, which he could populate with all manner of imaginary and historical characters. And of course, there's a very strong legacy of Anglo-Saxon culture in West Mercia particularly. So the dialect still contains very old pre-Norman conquest Anglo-Saxon words, and people are very proud of that heritage. I think that had a huge influence on him. One of the reasons he went on to become an Anglo-Saxon scholar and a Scandinavian scholar of the ancient Scandinavian myths was, I think, because he was just inculcated with this resilience. And
there's a
culture that is still a living one here, but not so much now as it was obviously 100 years ago or so.
Striking photo in the book of the Perrot's Folly at Edgbaston, which you suggest was Tolkien was one of the inspirations for the Two Towers.
Yeah, there's another one just down the road, which is an old water tower. It's on the same street. So he lived on Stirling Road in Edgbaston, literally round the corner from there. So he and his brother, on the way to school each morning, would walk past these towers, and even as a child, you know, he was kind of reinventing the built and natural landscape as a kind of an imaginative reality of his own, really. And the same goes for, you know, the Malvern Hills and things like that become the Misty Mountains, and the tower at the University of Birmingham, they called it Old Joe's Tower, after Joseph Chamberlain. Yeah. That was the inspiration for the Eye of Sauron and all of that, you know. So, I mean, extraordinary, really, to think that, you know, and I mean, a very difficult upbringing too, you know, because he lost his father, and he and his brother, you know, were brought up by his mother in quite straitened circumstances. And had it not been for the, you know, the excellent opportunities in the local schools, he probably would not have, you know, become what he did become, really. Looking to the
future, what are your next projects?
Yeah, I've just finished one now, but I've got to just do the photographs and things. But this one is more of a sort of military history. Again, a bit personal, because I mainly choose ones that I used to go to as a boy. So it's about forgotten battlefields of Britain. And in the new year, I'm going to start doing a thing, and it's all about literature and landscape, and about how literary people in this region over the centuries have been responding to this landscape in a way that you know has been really important in our culture. I mean, people like Houseman, obviously Tolkien, but there are a host of, you know, lesser known ones as they lay them on. This hermit who wrote this Brut, which is a history of Britain. Simon Evans, a postman as he was in Clibbury Mortimer, a chap from this village where I'm in now, Archie Hill. A lot of writers, they seem to be responding there to something. And I think there's a kind of mystery there about what that actually is. And so this isn't going to be so much of a historical thing, though. It's more of a kind of personal travelogue, but incorporating all these literary characters, all men, by the way. But there's a reason for that, because I think that what it is that whatever this spiritual force is in the landscape, I think it's female.
Right.
And what was originally personified as a goddess. And I think a lot of these people, even if they were not spiritual or religious or whatever, are kind of responding somehow to that underlying energy in the landscape. I think I'm calling it West. Just that, you know. So I talk a lot about the lost lands, you know, as the Welsh call these border counties in England, like Shropshire, Cheshire, Herefordshire, Worcestershire. They are still sort of emotionally conceived of for Welsh people as part of Wales, really.
Yeah.
And they are. You're not quite in England in some of these places, even where I am now, you know, and I'm 50 miles probably from the border, from Offers Dyke, but it's still really a Celtic place.
Yeah.
Where I am now. And there are even Welsh speakers here, believe it or not.
Ah.
So, I mean, there are, you know, there are all sorts of influences which can be missed, you know, and I want to try and unravel them all. I've always been interested in these things as I was a boy, really. So it's time to try to explicate them and hopefully do that in an entertaining way. And it's good for the soul, really, because I'm the sort of person, I think, who it helps me when I'm writing to kind of get to the meat of the matter.
No, I mean your book is a very good read. You know, you're not sort of wading your way through it out of duty. You just find yourself reading on and reading on and reading on. And it's one of those books that, you know, I started it and I would have read all night had I not been dragged off to bed. And, that's good because, books of this type can be worthy but dull. But yours is anything but dull. I say it's a very, very attractive read. And sort of one final question. You've got on the front cover, you've got a quote, "A remarkable book, an inspiration from the heart of the Shire" by Robert Plant. Now, that's Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin?
That's the man.
Yeah. How did you manage that?
I've known Robert for a while. He lives very near.
Right.
And when he's in England, we often bump into each other in a local hostelry or somewhere.
Yeah.
And chew the cud about all these things. He's always been fascinated by all this, and of course he's 20 years older than me.
Yeah.
And has been thinking about it for all that time. And I think what it was that when he discovered it, it really rang bells for him because, I mean, obviously his lyrics and ideas were very strongly influenced by Tolkien and things like that, and the landscape.
Oh, yes, yes.
And he grew up within a few miles of here. So we've been sort of friends for some time now, and he was quite impressed, and it's all been very helpful. Of course, get an endorsement from a rock star. I've had a few others involved as well. Bill Nelson's quite interested in it, and Julian Cope and a few other people.
Yeah, well, Julian Cope would be, yes. That's brilliant. Right, well, good luck with your future projects, and in the meantime, The Magical History of Britain by Martin Wall is published by Amberley. You can find them www.amberley-books.com. It's available in bookshops, and it's also available on Amazon. Thank you very much for your time, Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. Lovely to hear from you.
If you'd like to know more about Martin Wall's books, check out his website at www.historyeducation, that's all one word, .co.uk.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Today the words Yule and Yuletide are frequently used as an alternative Christmas or the holiday season. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, have a cool Yule. Just slogans we use on Christmas cards and gift tags. But what is Yule? In brief, Yule was the midwinter festival celebrated by the Germanic peoples of post-Roman Europe, peoples we'd now call the Saxons, or Anglo-Saxons in Britain. There is a linguistic evidence to suggest the concept of Yule festivities date back to the 4th century AD, but given these were primarily pre-literate cultures who left behind no written records, its origins may be far, far older. Yule was later adopted by the Norse people of Scandinavia, the people we know better as Vikings, and they tend to call it the Yule blot. We'll have a bit more about blots later. To these people, Yule was a period of celebrating the winter solstice, that turning point in the year when the nights stopped getting longer and the days began growing longer. Yes. It was time of hope, a recognition that winter was coming to an end and that summer would eventually return. It was a time of feasting, when livestock would be sacrificed and eaten. And it was a time of communal drinking, singing and merrymaking. Although there is some debate as to just how long the Yuletide celebrations lasted, some sources suggest 2 months from mid-November to mid-January, whereas the 10th century monarch King Haakon the Good, he was a Christian by the way, which is why it's called the Good, said it was 3 days or as long as the beer lasted. However, it's widely believed the period actually ran for 12 days, running from the winter solstice. So, for example, this year, Yule runs from Sunday the 22nd of December to Thursday, January the 2nd. The 12 days of Yule. No prizes for guessing where the Christian church found its inspiration for the 12 days of Christmas. And there are plenty of other connections between modern Christmas and ancient Yule. The feasting, admittedly more important in the Middle Ages when most people went hungry for most of the time, but even today in most parts of Western Europe we still eat more food over the Christmas holiday period than at any other time of the year. The same goes for the consumption of alcohol in many households, another throwback to the toasting and wassailing that used to take place in the great halls of the pagan Saxons. As already mentioned, the Old Norse name for these feast was the blot, the same word now adopted by neo-pagans for their festive gatherings, providing a nice continuity between the pre-Christian era and modern times. Then there's the Yule log, that great lump of tree trunk that was traditionally burned over the Christmas period, and all the associated rituals and folklore of sitting around it on an evening telling ghost stories and saving part of the log to help light the following year's Yule log. Although I must admit the rise of central heating and the decline of open fires effectively killed this tradition by the mid-20th century. But this is another one which its origins can clearly be traced back to the midwinter bonfires of Germanic paganism. And there's the Christmas tree. While generally credited as being popularised in modern times in the early 19th century, this too has a distinctly non-Christian origin. Indeed, the early Christian missionaries, when they were trying to convert the pagan Germanic tribes, spent much of their time chopping down sacred groves of trees. But, stretching back in time, one of the traditions of the pagan midwinter festivals was to bring wreaths fashioned from branches of evergreen trees, including fir, mistletoe and holly, into homes for luck and to celebrate the winter's decline. Then there's the tradition of the Yule boar, a wild boar that was sacrificed and eaten as part of the celebrations of Yule. This tradition still lives on today in the Christmas ham, which is cooked and eaten over the Christmas period. Or at least it was in my house. Then there's carol singing, or carolling, the modern day practice of going from door to door singing in the hope of being given food. Mince pies, anyone? Or money, which stems from another ancient Yule tradition of door-to-door wassailing or Yule singing. And then there's the identity, or at least the source of Santa Claus, or Father Christmas, depending on what you want to call him. Now, Santa is an amalgam of three distinct roots. There's St. Nicholas, traditionally depicted as an elderly bishop with long white hair and a long white beard. Then there's the image of Santa as a jolly little old man in a red suit trimmed with white fur, which stems from the 1823 poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, better known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, by Clement Clarke Moore, although it's actually the illustration by Thomas Nast that probably set the image. And finally, dating back in Protestant countries to the 16th and 17th centuries, this was after the veneration of St. Nicholas became religiously incorrect. The Christmas season came to be personified by a mythical character variously called Sir Christmas, Lord Christmas, or Old Father Christmas. He was an elderly gentleman dressed in a long fur-lined hooded blue or green or brown or purple, not red, robe sporting a long white beard, who kept alive the old traditions of Christmas, including generosity, charity, jollity and neighbourliness. The depiction of the ghost of Christmas present in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol accurately sums up the popular image of Old Father Christmas. But who or what was the inspiration for Old Father Christmas? The answer is Woden, or Odin in Old Norse, the ancient pagan god of northern Europe. He is older than Christianity. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century AD, described Woden as the main god worshipped by the German confederations of tribes. In fact, the veneration of Woden was so widespread that there were at least 170 different names for him, ranging from Aldaflur, the father of the world, to Igir, the terrible one, not forgetting Jolfar, the Yule father. See where we're going with that? Woden also survived for much longer than most pagan deities, For example, in the 12th century, 2 centuries after Norway was officially Christianized, Odin was still being invoked by the population, as was evidenced by some sticks bearing runic messages asking Odin for help, which were excavated in Bergen in 1955. And in terms of folklore traditions, as late as the 19th century on the Swedish island of Gotland, one writer recorded that many traditions and stories of Odin the Old still live on in the mouths of people, including the custom of leaving a sheaf of straw on the field for Odin's horses. Even today, in the English and Dutch-speaking world, Woden's name lives on as one of the days of the week, namely Wednesday, or Woensdag in Dutch. Incidentally, in Romance languages derived from Latin, the middle day of the week is based on the Roman god Mercury. So, for example, Mercredi in France. But intriguingly, the ancient Romans regarded Woden as the Germanic Mercury. So what was this Woden like? Well, being a god, he could take many forms, but apparently one of his favourite forms was that of an old traveller, sporting a long white beard, wearing a long blue cloak with hood and broad-brimmed hat. In fact, if you look at old 19th century Christmas greetings cards, this was long before the Coca-Cola image of Santa became so popular, you'll see Santa is frequently depicted in a blue hooded cloak. Woden also rode a horse, as did Santa in early Christmas cards, before it became more usual to show him on a sleigh being pulled by reindeer. Woden's horse was called Sleipnir, and it could fly across the skies, just like Santa with his reindeer. And in another interesting coincidence, Sleipnir had 8 legs. The same number as Santa's 8 reindeer. Rudolph, I should add, was a much later addition. And the similarities continue. Woden may not have lived in the North Pole, but he did live up near the Arctic Circle in a supernatural world called Asgard and was frequently having to battle frost giants. Woden was also surrounded by his own band of little helpers who could fashion magical gifts and trinkets in their workshops. They were dwarves and elves known as Odin's men in the Norse sagas. And Woden was also a gift bringer, delivering nice things and good fortune to people who had been good and bad luck to people who had been wicked. How did Woden know who had been good or bad? Because, like Santa many years later, Woden had a naughty list, although in his case it was compiled by his 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, who every morning would fly out to collect news from across the 9 worlds of Norse myth and bring it back to Woden on the evening. And in yet another similarity, in Nordic folklore, children hoping for Yuletide gifts from Woden would leave out their boots filled with straw and carrots for Sleipnir, in the expectation that in the morning the fodder would be gone and their boots would be filled with gifts. Does that sound familiar, like modern-day children hanging up a sock by the fireplace on Christmas Eve, along with leaving out mince pie and a glass of sherry for Santa? The whole Woden-Santa connection was neatly summed up a few years ago by the American folklorist Margaret Baker when she said, "The appearance of Santa Claus or Father Christmas, whose day is the 25th of December, owes much to Odin, the old blue-hooded, cloaked, white-bearded gift-bringer of the North, who rode the midwinter skies on his 8-footed steed Sleipnir, visiting people with gifts. Odin, over time, transformed into Father Christmas, then Santa Claus, and became a leading player on the Christmas stage." So, happy Woden's Day this Yuletide, and don't forget to leave out some carrots for Sleipnir. Right, here's another winter ghost story, and it's at Calcut in Wiltshire on the A419 road. Bizarrely, it's a Christmas Eve ghost, and it says several small white pigs with red ears cross the road once a year on Christmas Eve. Now, if it had been turkeys, then you could understand it, but not quite sure what the pigs have got to do with it. Now, here's another little one, and it's Dewsbury, and it's the Minster Church, the parish church of Dewsbury in Yorkshire. The legend has it that it's not legend, it's folklore tradition, that on the 24th of December, a bell called Black Tom is rung the number of times of the year. So, for example, in 2019, this year, it'll be tolled 2019 times. And this is apparently to ensure that the devil doesn't village the town during the following 12 months. Now, the trick is the last peal of the bells has to occur on the stroke of midnight, as in on the stroke of midnight before Christmas Day starts. The bell is called Black Tom, and it was actually a gift to the church by a certain Sir Thomas de Soothill. So I think there's a bit of a pun going there with Soot and Thomas. And it was a penance for murdering a servant boy in a fit of rage at some point in the 14th century. And the ringing of the bell is known as the devil's knell. That's knell as in ringing bells, not knell as in Nelly. Don't think the devil has a girlfriend called Nelly. And that's it. Time for me to go. It just remains for me to say thank you for listening, and I'll hope you'll join me again same time next week. Till then, this is Charles Christian saying goodbye, and may your gods and goddesses protect you from the ghosts of Christmas yet to come, angry frost giants, Krampus, Frau Perchta, Old Mother Grilla, and the awful Yule Cat. Although with the Yule Cat, just remember, buy new socks.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.